A jury sentenced Kirk Bloodsworth to death because several people believed they recognized him. There was no confession. There was no forensic evidence connecting him to the crime. Bloodsworth kept saying the witnesses were wrong. But the police believed them. The prosecutors believed them. And the jury believed them. Almost 9 years later, DNA finally answered the question. Kirk Bloodsworth was not the man who committed the crime. But here is the part that makes this case almost impossible to forget. Years after Bloodsworth was released, the same DNA identified the real killer. And during Bloodsworth's time in prison, that man had been living one floor below him. They exercised together. Bloodsworth brought books to his cell. For years, the innocent man and the real killer had been living in the same prison building. Neither of them said a word about the connection between them. So how did the wrong man get sentenced to death, while the real killer remained unidentified? The answer begins in Maryland in the summer of 1984. On July 25, 9-year-old Dawn Hamilton was visiting family friends in Rosedale, outside Baltimore. That morning, 2 boys were fishing at a pond in a wooded area. They later told police that a man had approached them and spoken with them. A short time later, Dawn came by looking for her cousin. The boys did not go with her, but according to their account, the man offered to help. He walked away with Dawn toward the woods. Later that day, Dawn was found dead. I am not going to linger on the graphic details. What matters here is that a child had been murdered in daylight, close to people's homes. The community was terrified. Parents wanted their children protected. Police needed to find the person responsible, and they needed to find him quickly. One of the boys helped investigators create a composite sketch of the man they had seen. Police released the drawing to the public. Then they received a tip. Someone said the sketch looked like Kirk Bloodsworth, a 23-year-old former Marine who had worked as a waterman on Maryland's eastern shore. Bloodsworth had no criminal record. But once his name reached the police, the investigation began moving toward him. Detectives placed his photograph in a photo array and showed it to the 2 boys. One child selected Bloodsworth. The other could not make a positive identification. Based largely on that first identification, police arrested him. 4 days later, the boys were taken to see a live lineup. This time, the first child did not identify Bloodsworth while the lineup was taking place. He later said he had recognized Bloodsworth but had been too frightened to say anything. The second child pointed to someone else. Later, he also said he had recognized Bloodsworth but had been afraid. That distinction is important. In the photograph, one child selected him. In the live lineup, neither child openly identified him at the time. One of them actually selected another man. But as the investigation continued, that uncertainty did not stop the case. Instead, it slowly hardened into confidence. By the time Bloodsworth entered a courtroom, the prosecution had several witnesses connecting him to Dawn or placing him near the area. An eyewitness testimony can be extremely powerful. A jury does not see the few seconds in which the original memory was formed. It does not experience the fear, confusion, or pressure surrounding that moment. The jury sees a witness sitting in court, looking across the room and pointing toward the defendant. That can feel like certainty. At Bloodsworth's trial in March 1985, prosecutors argued that he was the man who had walked into the woods with Dawn. Bloodsworth denied it. His wife, his mother-in-law, and 3 housemates testified that he had been at home on the day of the murder. The defense also challenged evidence involving marks found on Dawn's body. A shoe store owner testified that the marks appeared to have been made by shoes 2 sizes too small to fit Bloodsworth. There were other pieces of testimony that the prosecution used against him. A detective said Bloodsworth had spoken about a bloody rock connected to the crime. The prosecution treated that as information the killer might know. Bloodsworth denied making the statement. Another witness said Bloodsworth had told her that he had done something terrible. He said the conversation was about personal problems and drug treatment, not the murder of a child. None of those details proved his guilt by themselves. But that is not how a jury experiences a case. The prosecution placed the eyewitnesses, the statements, and the other circumstances next to one another. Together, they formed a story. And the jury accepted that story. On March 8, 1985, Bloodsworth was convicted of first-degree murder, first-degree rape, and first-degree sexual offense. 2 weeks later, the judge sentenced him to death. The state was no longer saying that Bloodsworth was probably guilty. A death sentence meant the state believed it was certain enough to take his life. Then the case developed its first serious crack. In 1986, Maryland's highest court overturned the convictions and ordered a new trial. But the court did not rule that Bloodsworth was innocent. It found that prosecutors had failed to give his defense a detective's report pointing to another possible suspect. In ordinary language, the state possessed information that might have helped Bloodsworth defend himself. His lawyers did not receive it before the first trial. The conviction was overturned. But Bloodsworth did not go home. The state prosecuted him again. In April 1987, a second jury heard the case, and a second jury convicted him. This time, the court sentenced him to life in prison rather than death. The second conviction was later upheld on appeal. That placed Bloodsworth in an almost impossible position. The first trial had sent him to death row. The second had sentenced him to life. Two juries had now declared him guilty. To anyone reading the legal record, the case looked finished. But Bloodsworth continued to say the same thing. The witnesses had identified the wrong man. Then science gave him a way to test that claim. In the early 1990s, DNA testing was beginning to change criminal investigations. Today, DNA evidence is familiar to almost everyone. At the time, using it to examine an old conviction was still unusual. The technology was developing. Courts were still learning how to handle it. And prisoners could not simply demand that evidence from an old case be found and tested. Bloodsworth and his lawyers kept pushing. In 1992, prosecutors agreed to release biological evidence from the case for DNA analysis. The evidence was sent to Forensic Science Associates in California. The laboratory tested biological material recovered from Dawn's clothing. The result excluded Kirk Bloodsworth. His DNA did not match the biological evidence. The FBI performed another test. It reached the same conclusion. The witnesses had pointed toward Bloodsworth. The DNA pointed away from him, and unlike human memory, the DNA did not become more confident with time. It simply did not match. On June 28, 1993, Bloodsworth walked out of prison. His conviction had been vacated, and the case against him was dismissed. He had spent almost 9 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. Part of that time had been spent under a death sentence. In December 1993, Maryland Governor William Donald Schaefer granted him a full pardon based on innocence. Bloodsworth became the first death row prisoner in the United States to be exonerated through post-conviction DNA testing, but his release answered only half of the question. The DNA had shown that Bloodsworth was not the killer. It had not yet shown who was. For another decade, Dawn Hamilton's real killer remained officially unidentified. Then, in 2003, investigators tested additional DNA evidence and searched the resulting profile through the FBI's National DNA Database. This time, they found a match. The DNA belonged to Kimberly Shea Ruffner. Ruffner was already serving a long prison sentence for another violent sexual attack committed shortly after Dawn's murder. He was not some unknown man who had disappeared to another part of the country. He had spent years inside the same Maryland prison as Bloodsworth. Ruffner slept on the tier directly below him. The two men exercised in the same prison weight yard and sometimes helped spot each other while lifting weights. Bloodsworth worked in the prison library. He regularly brought books to Ruffner's cell and stopped to speak with him. They were not close friends. They were simply two prisoners who recognized each other and occasionally talked. Ruffner knew why Bloodsworth was in prison. He knew that Bloodsworth had been convicted of Dawn's murder. He knew that Bloodsworth was trying to prove his innocence. But according to Bloodsworth, Ruffner never revealed anything. When Bloodsworth was finally cleared and released in 1993, Ruffner was still there. He saw the innocent man leave prison without admitting that he was responsible for the crime that had placed him there. 10 years later, prosecutors came to Bloodsworth's home and told him that the DNA had identified Ruffner. For years, the answer had literally been living one floor below him. Ruffner was charged with Dawn Hamilton's murder in September 2003. In 2004, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. The same DNA evidence had now accomplished two things. It had proved that the state convicted the wrong man, and it had identified the man the state should have convicted. That is why this case is not simply a story about DNA technology. DNA did not travel back in time and prevent the wrongful conviction. It could only help because biological evidence had been preserved. Bloodsworth and his lawyers had to keep fighting for access to it. Scientists had to test it, and years later, investigators still had to compare the DNA with a national database before the real perpetrator could be identified. The case also shows why eyewitness evidence must be treated with care. The witnesses did not have to be dishonest for the identification to be wrong. A person can sincerely believe that a face looks familiar, A frightened child can make a mistake. A memory can be affected by photographs, repeated questioning, and the simple passage of time. And once someone has selected a suspect, that choice can begin to feel more certain each time the story is repeated. The first identification may contain hesitation. By the time the witness reaches the courtroom, the hesitation may have disappeared. But confidence is not the same thing as accuracy. The most troubling part of Bloodsworth's case is not that one person made one mistake. The mistake passed through almost every level of the justice system. Investigators focused on him. Prosecutors built a case against him. Multiple witnesses connected him to the crime. A jury convicted him. A judge sentenced him to death. An appellate court ordered a second trial, and a second jury convicted him again. The process looked formal, it looked careful, and it was wrong. After his release, Bloodsworth became an advocate for criminal justice reform and access to post-conviction DNA testing. The Justice for All Act of 2004 later authorized a federal DNA testing grant program bearing his name. The program helps states review old convictions, locate biological evidence, and pay for testing that may establish innocence. That is an extraordinary outcome. A man once sentenced to death by the justice system later helped create a way for that system to correct other mistakes. But his story still leaves us with a difficult question. Bloodsworth had DNA evidence. It had been preserved. It could be tested. And the result clearly excluded him. Many defendants never have that chance. Some cases contain no biological evidence. Sometimes the evidence has been lost or destroyed. Sometimes there is nothing left for science to examine. So what happens when a conviction depends on a witness who sounds certain, but there is no DNA available to prove that the witness is wrong? A death sentence is supposed to represent the highest level of certainty the justice system can reach. In Kirk Bloodsworth's case, that certainty was wrong. And without DNA, the mistake might have remained official forever.